My guest today is Mark Appel. Mark has nearly 40 years of global mediation experience, having served in both executive and senior executive positions at the American Arbitration Association and International Center for Dispute Resolution. He's mediated cases, including complex multi-party cases in various industries, including construction and infrastructure, energy, technology, commercial finance, joint venture partnership, and real estate. He's also assisted in training arbitrators and mediators on 4 continents on behalf of various institutions, government ministries, courts, and NGOs. Mark is a delight to talk to, and with such diverse professional and personal experience, he has a wealth of knowledge and perspective to share. Our conversation covers topics including building trust, active listening, asking probing questions, positions of power, and much more. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Mr. Mark Appel. All right. Well, Mark, it's great to see you again. I appreciate you coming on and taking the time to share your time and knowledge with us today. And I'm excited for this conversation.
No worries. It's a pleasure.
So can you explain exactly what a mediator does and how did you become one? How did you get involved?
Yeah. The easiest way to understand the mediation and the role of the mediator is to look at mediation as an extension of the negotiation process. Okay. So negotiation, you have one or two or more parties negotiating. What a mediator does is helps negotiation. In fact, to distinguish mediation from arbitration, which you see in the commercial sector a lot, is to use two different words. So you think of the mediator as a helper and the arbitrator as a decider. Okay, an easy way to define mediation is facilitated negotiation, because that's what it is. You make negotiation better. That's significant because most disputes, most issues are resolved, and they're resolved by way of negotiation. Historically in the U.S. and frankly in most countries, the percentage of cases that are filed in courts and actually go to trial is remarkably small. Like well over 90% are settled. Okay.
Oh, wow.
So what does that tell you? You have to rethink everything you've ever thought about your right to trial by jury and so forth. What you're really bargaining for when you go into court is a lengthy, expensive negotiation process. So think about it. What if you could cut short the time and the costs and find your own solution, which is what typically happens anyway, but in a much abbreviated fashion, with the assistance of a helper who's called a mediator. And how did I get to it? Well, I got to it because my entire professional career has been in dispute resolution or conflict management, including my education. Unusually, I was my university major was a rather unusual one. It was peace, and people sometimes look aside and say, "Well, how do you get a job? With that degree?" And the truth is, I got a job working right out of school. Even before I graduated from university, I was working for the American Arbitration Association. So while still a student, I was doing studies for them, and they offered me a job actually before I'd even finished. So I went straight into the field at the right age of 21. And it sort of took its course. I was sort of introduced to the mediation process. While I was introduced to it while I was running in office, I was sort of did everything on a bit of an accelerated basis. My first job was running labor union elections, but that's for another day. At the age of 25, opened an office for the American Arbitration Association in Denver, Colorado, and came to understand the mediation process. Colorado and Denver was actually quite innovative in terms of justice, sort of alternative dispute resolution solutions. I was a quick study. I did a bit of work with a guy who was a fabulous negotiator. He had worked for the Federal Mediation and Service. So, those people you read about who, when there's a particularly nasty impasse in labor management negotiations, and they say a federal mediator came in. I have to work with that guy. His name was Tom Colosi, amazing human being. And I learned an awful lot from him. And I started teaching. I never got trained as a mediator, but I've been training mediators for 50 years. And I just got introduced to the process relatively quickly, started training and teaching, and then doing mediation. I was also in the position where people would trust me, and trust is an important issue when you are bargaining from the middle. Because I was an executive and a regional director, I would have counsel, that's legal counsel, approach me and say, would you help us, resolve this matter? And so I was the mediator, and got to mediate lots of interesting disputes while I was running that office. So that's sort of where
you went to law school. You went to law school also, right?
I actually went to law school nights after I had taken a position running that office. So I was working full time during the day, going to law school at night, and even working on weekends, doing case files on weekends, mostly arbitrations, but doing case files, administrative work, really. By the time I graduated, I started teaching in the same school I went to law school in. It was kind of odd. But that's what happens. I had an expertise that was a little bit different, and was in a position to add value. This was again in Denver. It was the University of Denver College of Law. And then also at they had a program in their Department of Speech Communications. It was a master's in conflict resolution. And so I would teach in that program as well. But I enjoyed teaching, just like I enjoyed mediating. There's a lot, you get so much back. It's a great way to learn.
So the job, did that inspire you to go to law school? Were there any
oh, yeah, absolutely.
aspirations you had with that?
Yeah. Well, the biggest one is that, of course, conflicts are still, in many ways, the gatekeeper to a particularly commercial conflict is the lawyer, and so speaking legalese, I'm one of you, was important to me. So whether I ever chose to practice law in a sort of a classic context or not, it was a useful thing to me. I ended up becoming a member of the board of governors of the bar, of the Colorado bar, and then years later moved back to New York to become an executive vice president, and then to Europe, to Dublin to run Europe, Middle East, and Africa operations for the ICDR, the American Arbitration Association.
So you don't necessarily need a law degree to be a mediator, but it obviously helps speak the language. I mean, every industry kind of has their own language that they speak.
You know why it does? It does because it's a matter of trust, and lawyers are I'll just say careful, and you are more likely to gain their trust if they see you as being one of them, So
yeah, it makes sense.
There's some very good mediators, I should say, world class, that are not lawyers, more than a few.
Yeah. So you transitioned into the international setting. Tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, I was interested because while I'm in Denver, which is 1980s, we're talking a long time ago. NAFTA was created, North American Free Trade Agreement, right? And NAFTA is Mexico, U.S., and Canada. Well, interestingly enough, there's a straight line between Mexico and Canada, and it goes right through Denver, Colorado. It's there they would call it the Valley Highway, or I-25. So was a great deal of interest in regionally in this development, and I took on a role with others in actually establishing a sort of institution called which whether you pronounce it in Spanish or in English, it's Commercial Arbitration and Mediation Center for the Americas. So it was a fun, and so I got introduced to international matters. Then I managed to move back to New York, where I had to actually shut that down because the American Arbitration Association, or AAA, started its own international division. And so when that happened, we sort of ended Camp Cup. But I had my taste. I moved back to New York, became an executive vice president of the AAA, and ran several different parts of the business for the AAA for a couple of years, including mediation and infrastructure, which is a big user of dispute resolution. Then in 2001, the organization was thinking of growing internationally and wanted to open its first office. Well, my CEO knew that I was an Irish citizen. So he said, "What do you think?" And I said, absolutely. So we opened an office for the AAA in Dublin, Ireland. And so I ended up managing Europe, Middle East, and Africa, for the organization. So I became much more international very quickly. And I've actually been in Europe since then. I'm a citizen of Ireland.
Not by birth, but by generational.
By generational, exactly. My mom's family. So my grandparents.
Nice.
So I came by it honestly. It gave me the opportunity to work and live in Europe. And I've been here, since 2001. I mean, I'm speaking to you now from London, which is where I live now and where my chambers is located.
Yeah, I believe you said you split your time between London and Malta, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I had to say more recently, I've been spending most of my time in London.
Where all were you located during your international career?
Well, all over. I mean, like I said, it was Europe, Middle East, Africa. So when people used to say, "Where do you live?" I used to say, I think the seat number was 6B. I lived on a plane.
Right.
I mean, I traveled, that's what I did. So I spent time really all over, not just Europe, the Middle East and Africa, but also even Asia, so, I mean, China, Hong Kong, Malaysia, and then most of the Middle East, and more than my share of places in Africa as well. Also, what used to be called Eastern Europe, and now is called Central Europe.
Wow.
St. Petersburg, Moscow. So really quite well traveled, if nothing else.
Any favorites?
Oh gosh, it's so funny. I had a guy today. I met a guy today over lunch, and he said, "I'm happy wherever I am." And I really think if you're a serious internationalist, you find a way to find what you need just about anywhere. So I have lots of favorites.
Yeah, I get that. I've lived all over the U.S. I think 12 plus states I've lived in, and everywhere I've lived, there's people there that love it, and there's people there that hate it, and there's always something good about each location.
Oh, I think that's right.
Some more than others, obviously, but
no, I think that's right. You find what's best about a place, or what fits you best about a place. And if you're flexible enough as a person, which is, I think, what you need to have to be successful in anything international, you could pretty well make it no matter wherever you go.
So we talked a little bit about mediation skills. You majored in peace. That's the first time I've actually ever heard that as a major. What are some other essential skills to a mediator?
Peace studies, of course, was a multidisciplinary study. So you studied very interesting subjects. I mean, things like the history of war. I mean, biology of human behavior. I mean, you can get into some pretty interesting places if you start. If you think of it as an interdisciplinary study. Skills for mediators are, I think, at this point, pretty well known. I mentioned the word trust, and you really need to, if you're going to be guiding and assisting parties, and with no power to make a decision. You're not an arbitrator, you're not a judge. You really have to you have to earn their trust first, and personally, and so learning how to do that is a critical skill, and then maintaining that throughout the course of the process is critical to your success. So learning how to engage with parties. I think respect is an important issue, and treating parties with respect. I think understanding that gaining trust starts with the very first time you pick up a telephone or get somebody on a video. Um, uh, uh, Silly things, but maybe not so silly, like showing up on time and knowing what's going to happen, having an agenda and following it. I mean, these all seem like little things, but they're kind of important in terms of your success. And then I guess beyond that, sort of just critically, communication skills and particularly listening skills. You know, what people call active listening.
Yeah.
You know, so not just listening, but listening.
Listening to understand.
Listening to and communicating that understanding. And how do you do that? Well, you do it by typically by asking additional questions that show you're listening, maybe by summarizing what you just heard,
Let them know that you understand what they are saying.
Jumping it right back. I hear you saying that, and then even by probing, beyond that. Well, I hear you saying that. Where does that, what's important about that? What's important for you? And all of that is critical because people sometimes say things and they just sort of blurt them out and they don't even probe them. They don't even think themselves why they say it,
Mm-hmm.
And if you can ask some questions and ask them in a sort of thoughtful, respectful way, you can help people sort of see what motivates them and what's important to them. Help them have a better understanding of themselves, of their own motivations, of their own interests, of their own priorities. I mean, what's more important to you? I'll tell you a fun one. So here's a fun one. I was thinking of this today, actually. It's funny how things remind you. But I remember doing a mediation skills training in the beautiful city of Detroit many, many years ago and having a school board member attending the training and talking about, how do you assist parties in understanding what's important. And she said, well, what we try to do is we divide our issues in our into three buckets in terms of needs. And so we have try for, buckets, and then we have cry for buckets, so slightly escalated. And then we have die for buckets. So helping people through that exercise really does assist the process. Because when people then can self-reflect on what they're doing and what they're asking for, and it makes it easier then to go back and have a conversation with their counterparty and say, what have we got here? And I think this will move us. And if we can get some movement on X, we can do, Y. And of course, that's negotiation. Just lots of it is packaging. How do you put together something that will, get the matter resolved? And frequently it's not something, and this is why mediation is so powerful, it's not something that's available to a judge or an arbitrator. So mediation, you can tear up the contract. You can rewrite it, You can do all kinds of things. You can move the person's desk from that side of the room to the other side of the room. Why is that important? Well, because when the person's desk was on that side of the room, there was nothing but trouble. But on this side of the room, it actually works, That's a very mundane sort of employment kind of issue, but these things happen. And court is not the best place to resolve those, So having someone who's engaged, who can, engage people's trust, who can help them understand what motivates them, what their real interests are, and then try to create some solutions. It helps to be creative.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
go ahead. No,
I was just going to say, I've had a lot of success with active listening. I call it empathic listening, but just listening to understand, because when you start from a place of debate, the wall goes up and nothing is getting through. You're just using that time to formulate an answer or argument, and actually no communications going on.
Not only that, you're setting yourself up as an adversary.
Right.
The worst thing in the world for a mediator to do is to start arguing with one of the one of the parties. I mean, it's absolutely contrary to your role. That's not your role. It's not your decision, and it's not your values. Yeah, and your values may well be different from the person who's sitting across from you or on the phone with you or on the video with you. And understanding that is important. And in an international context, it may be even more important because they may not share the same legal tradition. They may not share the same social traditions. So what they think is important may be entirely different than what you think is important. And that's why listening's important. You got to what's important for you.
Yeah, starting from a place of trust and understanding, and then you can work into the issues.
And neutrality and understanding yourself and not letting your own sort of prejudices get in the way, not your job and not your decision, not your values, all important.
So what does the role of cultural competence play in what you did internationally?
It's enormous. It's enormous because cultures are different, because people are different. And one of my failings, the old joke is, what do you call somebody who speaks 3 languages, trilingual, 2 bilingual, and 1 USA, and
that's so true.
My language, well, it's sad. And my language skills are not great. But what works for me is that I'm able to engage with people across cultures, and I've been able to do that for my entire career. And some of that is just respect, is learning something about them, is listening carefully and watching. You listen with your eyes, just listen with your ears.
Yeah, we speak with our bodies more than
everything
anything.
you do. Everything you do, and treating people well, and then those things tend to work out. And because you get the requisite trust you need to work with them across cultures. But it absolutely does impact the process. And you need to be sensitive to things. What day of the week is it? Or what are the holidays? What are their traditions? Who on the other side of the table needs to be given slightly more deferential treatment, And why? Because hierarchies are important in this particular culture.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So you have to be awake and aware and careful.
And how do you maintain neutrality in these situations? I mean, emotions, I'm sure, come into play. How does that resonate with you?
Well, it's very interesting you say that, because emotions can be very what's acceptable in terms of emotional outbursts in one culture can be completely different in another, completely different. And being sensitive to what's allowable and what's not can absolutely impact your process. So you have to be aware. You have to be aware. The fact that it's not enough. There are lots of people who do business around the world who I would say are not internet. I don't know how to say it nicer way than that. And there are people who are very much the case, and who are comfortable being in situations where people don't look the same as they do, talk the same as they do, act the same, eat the same.
What do you mean by that? They just don't respect other cultures, or
it's not that they don't respect them. It's that they are not comfortable in that skin, in that setting, and they're not used to it, and it shows. It shows. You can read books on understanding some cultural dialogues. The IMI, the International Mediation Institute, actually gives a certification in cross-cultural skills for mediators. So it's important, There was a very respected author named Hofstadter who wrote about culture and how different cultures react to particular issues. And so, thinking through that, how are decisions made? Who makes them? All important for you if you're going to be effectively, assisting these people at the process.
Let's say you have a situation where you have a significant power imbalance between, say a more powerful party negotiating with a far less powerful party. How do you have any examples of situations like that, and how did you work through it?
Yeah, power imbalances have always been a big issue in mediation, and I remember in the United States for years when I was active there, because you saw mediation being offered in the context of consumer disputes, and you got a big company on one side and a little person on the other side. And what I've always found interesting is sort of, and my own observation is that power comes from a lot of different places, and money isn't necessarily the only place that it comes from. I could tell you stories about single persons not represented by counsel absolutely having their way in a negotiation with a very powerful commercial entity on the other side. And, whether it was self-righteous indignation or just a compelling story that the company would absolutely hate to hear in a courthouse. Power comes from interesting places. I'll give you a one in the context of sort of investor state mediation that I deal with now. So you think about a very poor developing country and dispute with a rather large multinational interest, whether it be energy or mining or you name it. And you would say, well, that's a power imbalance. But the multinational needs what the state has. The multinational doesn't have the resources. The state has the resources, and that puts them in a very powerful position in terms of negotiating the settlement. And they have a resource that the company wants for the next 20 years. So not for now, but for a long, long time. So it would behoove a investor to find the solution whenever possible that allows them to continue to take advantage of the resources that they have access to now.
Right.
At the same time, flip the switch, right? So what about the state? Well, the state, especially if it's a developing country, needs foreign direct investment. They need FDI, and they need it bad, So, talking makes sense for them as well. And by the way, you have to ask, and mediators always ask, what's your alternative? In negotiation terminology, it's called your BATNA. What's your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, and what's it going to take? And if that means a treaty arbitration that lasts 10 years and costs the state and the investor upwards of 10 million each, then maybe it's worthwhile considering something else. Maybe it's worth considering talking and perhaps arriving at some sort of a settlement. So it's the mediation, I think, generally speaking, has a bright future ahead of it because as humans, disputes happen. They are natural, not even necessarily bad by any stretch of the imagination, but worthy of resolving, and worthy of resolving short of court arbitration, Armageddon.
So you deal with whole countries, whole industries, really, yeah. And then even individual companies, and then individual persons. So do all those different situations look the same, or does each one have, I'm sure each one has its own nuances and approaches.
Every single case is different, and every single industry, every single user of mediation and other sort of conflict management processes has its own nuance, its own sort of different needs, priorities. And they really have to be considered that way. I mean, I've spent many, many years creating process for industry or for institutions. So I think when we last talked, I mentioned a process I'm working on right now. Actually, now it's been published for this Caribbean Dispute Resolution Institution. So all caps CARO, and it is for major infrastructure projects. But it is in recognition of the United Nations development goals, which now have become important, particularly in the area of renewable energy. and recognizing that, when you're putting a plant in where a community used to exist, you might literally want, you might want to engage the community before you start. And there are lots of examples of those kinds of projects failing for a lack of engagement. So what we've tried to do is put together a process that really requires stakeholder engagement right from the beginning of the project. And it'll be interesting to see where it goes. I will say that companies in particular, but even states, sometimes say, well, but that's going to cost me money, and I think they have to think about what the alternative is. So is it worthwhile spending a little bit of money to keep a project, a major globally financed project on track, and versus face off in some multiple courts and a treaty arbitration, somewhere in the world, and that great expense, and who knows what else happens. So
What about different legal frameworks when you're working?
Yeah. No, good to think about. You have to think about it because, is it a matter of contract? Is it a contractual matter? Is it a requirement of a convention? Is it a global sort of framework? Is it a treaty that was entered into between, your state, or that your state entered into that gives access to private investors in terms of a resolution process? What's the ratification process? What's it going to look like if you don't get it done? And even if you do, you talk about how do you work with different parties? I will tell you, it is considerably different working with a state than it is with a community stakeholder group. The state cases involving states, you could have 6 different state agencies involved in the same dispute. Who's going to represent them? Who has the authority to agree to anything? Who's going to show up in the process? There's a great expression. It's a bit difficult, but it's very visual. It's called getting the pig through the python. If you think about it, it's a lot of work. And a lot of that goes to what are you dealing with, and how do you make sure that you got everybody lined up that you need to have lined up, and when do you address those issues in the process? And I will tell you, the closer you get to settlement in any matter, the hotter and the tougher and the more important and the less time there is. So there's lots of pressure. It's for people who negotiate 90% of the case, 10% of the time.
Right at the end.
Right at the end. It's the classic. It's the courthouse steps. But people make bad decisions when they're under the gun. So if anything, for people who are engaged in process, they really need to think about, especially as they're approaching solutions, weighing them up and thinking carefully through them. And I think that's part of your role as a mediator, is keeping people at the table, recognizing, what's happening in the process. It's complex, but it's fun.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm guessing the process, takes a while, can go smoothly, and then near the end, it's like a pressure cooker. People start getting nervous. Did I agree to the right things? Did I make the right decisions? Start second guessing themselves, and
you have a role, and your role is to keep them on track. So I'll give you an example. It's not unusual in a negotiation for a party at the last minute to throw in what's called a kicker. And the kicker is something they've never asked for before, but they're going to ask for it now because you're right at the doorstep, and they're just going to sort of throw this in and see if it works. Well, it's a great way to tube an agreement, or pressure enough on the other side to get something that you really, wouldn't have gotten otherwise. But one of the things as a mediator you need to do in that circumstance is say, how much is this? How important is this? Is this worth losing the deal over?
Yeah. Do any cases come to mind where there was a creative solution that you worked through with any parties?
I think what's more important than particular creative solutions is that you actually entertain them. In other words, that you create the sort of seminal book on negotiation still is getting to yes, and one of the 4, I think, sort of key sort of points in that book is creating multiple options for settlement. I think the reason you do that in part is it frees up people to think carefully about what they're doing. And sometimes some of the creative settlements that you come up with, even if they're not agreed upon, what they do allow is for people to say, okay, now I can think more clearly. And they typically go back to, pounds, shillings, and pence, as a way of resolving their matter. But they've at least thought through, this sort of a deal. I mean, in a business context, let me give you a business context. I remember 1,000 years ago. So I'm a young mediator, and I'm doing a medical partnership, and they've been in court for 4 years, right? These are doctors, bright people, all of them, and they really don't like each other much, and they're arguing over money, of course. And I asked them, I say, where else is there value in the partnership? And I say, what about those machines you've got? No, we got a lively discussion going about the equipment in the office, the value of particular pieces of the equipment. In the end, it didn't solve it didn't settle on the equipment exchange. But what it did was it opened their minds up a little bit. It got them, sort of talking and kept them talking. And just the creating of these possible alternative solutions allowed for better dialogue, and in the end, a decision. And, somewhere around 2:00 in the morning, I remember celebrating by eating pizza in my office in Denver. That's a long time ago.
So yeah, I guess that kind of comes back to starting from a place of trust, getting people on the same page, just small, something small both parties can agree on, and then working from there.
Well, that's right. And when you reach a point of impasse, or you're getting close to impasse, you really do need to think, what's it going to take? Is it a break? Is it what do I do? Mediators, maybe not surprisingly, sometimes ask for help, and you'd be amazed when you ask for help. People, if they trust you, they say, well, why don't you try this? I had a infrastructure case here where one party absolutely was not buying it, in terms of the arguments of the employer, no, the contractor. And the contractor said, well, why don't I put together a presentation just on these 3 points, and let us give it. We'll sit through it and then talk about it. In fact, it worked. And that was his suggestion. So it was, why are counsel useful in mediation? This was the lawyer's, suggestion. It was a good one, and it worked. Got the matter settled.
Who would you typically go to for advice on, cases, additional perspectives? Was it the lawyers, or did you have members or other?
Yeah. You might talk to, you can't talk about the specifics of any case with anybody else. So that, it's what your confidentiality is a big part of the process. And you've got to maintain that as a mediator, not just during the process, but after. Otherwise your trust goes out the window. You breach that, you're toast. But you can, it can be a bit lonely, but you can also, if you have colleagues in the field, you can always say, you can always stay up to date in terms of techniques and ideas and particular issues and all the rest of it. You just can't get too on a particular case. You'd have to be very careful about who do you talk to.
Because even, individual person, it's easy to get focused, tunnel vision on, and to be able to look at a simple solution.
Yeah, you'd be amazed. I remember dealing with energy cases, and there was an argument or a sort of request that we start publishing, decisions of arbitrators with energy cases. And I remember the industry coming back and saying, you do this, you'd have to sanitize the heck out of that decision, because everybody will know who you're talking about. This won't be, one of the reasons people choose mediation is confidentiality. And frankly, it's helpful because you need it to get people to open up. If parties are not going to open up, if they think that what they say with you is going to show up, it's going to get reported back to their counterparty or published in the papers or, whatever. So
I'm sure you came across situations where one or both parties are resistant to resolution.
Yeah.
How do you go about handling something like that?
It's tough. And you start by saying it's your process, and you came in voluntarily, and you can leave anytime you want. And then you say, but, let me tell you about Then you tell them a story. You tell them a story of somebody who was similarly situated who found a solution. And you do that. Allegory is a very powerful tool for a mediator because you could learn by other people's examples. It's hard to deal with your own, but if you can talk about somebody else's missteps or positive steps, sometimes that's a way to engage people. In the end, though, their choice.
Yeah, put the burden of responsibility on them to work through the solution and
It's
work
not
through it with them.
not your issue. They can walk away, and you need to let them know that you're okay with that.
That reminds me, I have a 6-year-old daughter and she doesn't want to listen to me. I want to teach her things. And then someone suggested to me to say, well, I heard about someone doing it this way. Let me show you what they told me. And she's much more receptive to hearing what someone else about it than what I have to say about it. So
Sure.
it seems
Or the old parental, do what I say, not what I do, which is, of course, very effective as a technique for you. No, that's very good. I will say that negotiation and mediation is particularly difficult in interpersonal relations because everything you say is loaded. All the statements you make recall things that you've done or things that you've said, and they usually create all kinds of conversations within the other person's mind about here it comes again, and I've been here before. So anything you could do, whether it's asking a question or referencing somebody else's actions, but to take them out of that spin is a good thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, taking parties as you find them. One of the things you said, what if they have different styles of negotiation? The what's talked about a lot in negotiation is, competitive versus cooperative, or collaborative styles, and how do you deal with each? And I think, in fact, you have to deal with each frequently. So, say for a collaborative, you really want to manage their expectations and help them along. Competitive, you've almost got to create doubts because and the way you create doubts is by asking questions, not by arguing. Ever.
Would competitive mean that, they're not going to come to an agreement unless they get the upper hand?
Yeah, or they're going to do it like this. They're going to negotiate. And by the way, that happens. And if a party is determined that I'm going to move 5 cents at a time, and, you have to sort of get yourself set for a lengthy negotiation, and that's what you're dealing with. But in particular industries, that kind of thing is commonplace. On the other hand, if you can get people that can think a bit more broadly, your agreement can end up being far, far better than anything that could have been done by any court. You can end up with an agreement that enlarges the relationship between the parties, that makes it a better one, So I think it's, but you don't always have a choice. I mean, you have to take the parties as you find them,
Do you think there's a mindset difference between competitive and cooperation being like a scarcity and abundance mindset? Does that resonate with you at all?
It could be. It could be. It could just be a cultural, phenomena. So I years past, many years ago, I did a fair amount of work involving insurance, claims and what's in there. That tends to be a very, 5 cents at a time sort of negotiation. And that's just what they do. And that is because it is a finite resource. It is about money and how much you're willing to pay and how much you're willing to take. And those are tough, when you're dealing with
industry specific.
But that's a very industry specific example. One of the skills that we didn't talk about much is the ability to reframe statements into problems that can be resolved. And your operations have made our lives a living hell, is the kind of statement you'd hear. And then, as a mediator, so what I understand you saying is that the project is creating real difficulties for your community. Why don't you tell me about that? And that's just reframing. And a reframe is what mediators do all the time. So you turn a statement into a problem, and a problem that can be resolved. And it's a critical skill. It's important.
Skills we've talked about, empathy, trust, reframing, were these inherent to you as a person? Did you learn these, do you think, growing up? I mean, I know you honed these skills over time, but I would imagine that you had a certain level of these skills naturally or just, by virtue of the environment you grew up in.
Sure. I mean, probably a little bit of both, nature versus nurture, you know. Certainly you grow up in an environment as I did where there's a very sort of open, nurturing, accepting, sort of culture, big family, big Irish Catholic, you know, big Irish Catholic family, lots of guests in the house, lots of strangers in the house, all welcome, you know, um, uh, community concerns at the top of the agenda, and particularly for people who might not be situated the same way as you are. Uh, I think it helps, but having said that, the specific skills are absolutely worth working on, and I write notes to myself as a mediator. I write little notes that little stupid little things like ask more questions, you
Yeah.
know?
People
And,
ask more questions.
well, and it's the truth, because what you can find yourself doing is slipping into a judgmental, mindset, which is wrong and just the wrong place to be. So the way to do it is to be reflective, be open, be listening, and I think the more you do, the better you get.
So I mean, you wanted to see people who get along. You grew up in that environment where,
Well, I grew up and I was comfortable in that environment. Yeah. And um, it was also the kind of environment where there, lots was going on all the time. And that didn't bother me. I mean, for people who are sort of more narrowly, sort of focused, I think it's hard when you get into these complex situations where you've got things coming at you from 6 different sides. And if you're used to that, I mean, I lived in a house where the television, the radio, and 6 neighbors were all talking at the same time in the house I was living in. So it sort of made it a bit easier for those
yeah,
kind of things to happen.
yeah.
And that probably helped. Probably helped, but it wasn't far short of that being, the only thing that counts. I don't know that mediators are born, but
Well, yeah, I think environment certainly is a big factor in that. It sounds like you had some
those,
great inputs and direction early on.
yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure.
So I'm gonna jump back a little bit. I can edit out all these awkward pauses or different things, but going back to the energy sector, I know you worked on whole industries, and energy being one of those, which is everything. And I'm sure
Sure.
you have some interesting cases and stories
Oh,
related to that.
right.
Can you share? Does anything come to mind that you can share?
Well, I can share what I can share is that is not so much disputes I was engaged with, but the ones that have absolutely blown up because parties didn't engage. So I lived in Ireland. I lived in Dublin for years, and one of the big oil companies, I won't mention which one, but you can look it up easily enough, wanted to start a major a project. It's called the Corrib. It's a matter of public record, and it was an enormous uh, energy project. The company was faced with sort of your common enough sort of objections from community members. Now, whether they be environmental, I think there were fishermen who were engaged, the environmental community and the community in general were sort of nervous, and the company chose to um, rely on the law, which, like we can rely on the law. The law says if we received the project permission to go forward under these circumstances and this contract, we're okay and we should be able to proceed. Well, that was great until people started chaining themselves to the fences and, just creating general mayhem. And eventually the project stopped. It didn't go forward. Similar, I'll give you another one. There's a recent one, not mine, but there's a recent renewables a matter in the U.S., New England, in the great state of Maine, where you got a pipeline going through, taking hydro energy, which is great, necessary for heating. And, New England's got its issues in terms of cold winters and needs for, and you would think this would be a good thing. But again, there was a letdown either non-existent or non-committal to sort of engagement with the community that the matter was sort of that the line was going through. And the truth of the matter is, in all of these projects, permission not only needs to be given, but it needs to be maintained. And that permission can be withdrawn. It can be taken away. And that's what happened there. And so it ran into trouble. Ended up federal court. I mean, at the very best, or at the very least, it produced an enormous delay in the project and untold millions in terms of and loss of investment, value and all the rest, and all because they didn't do it right. Wasn't didn't think through it. Didn't engage. Thought they could rely on the law.
Well, you've mentioned, essentially community buy-in now 2-3 times. And so that seems like an extremely important factor in these
major
projects.
public projects. In major public projects, it absolutely is. And the truth of the matter is that governments are now becoming more sensitive to it, are committing themselves to, international standards, things like net zero, and and when they do that, even when they do it sort of as a what would be called sort of soft law, that's being taken into account by judges. So judges are looking at that saying, well, didn't you just agree to this? Now you're not gonna pay attention to that. It just doesn't play well. So the way that particularly in an investor state context, the way that these multinationals look at these matters really needs a change of sort of approach. Even things like impact statements. Impact statements used to be created as part of the contractual process, but not atypically were done by the contractor and not for the particular benefit of the community that they were doing it for. It was more to say, here's where we think the issues are going to come from. So there wasn't engagement. There was just, here are the things we need to deal with. And what a surprise that they might have been slightly self-serving, not understandable to the community, and not particularly effective. And so creating issues. So the concept is, if you're going to run this massive project, have the brains to at least engage, first with the community. Try to find people that really know, bring them into the process, and keep them in the process.
I feel like people generally think that they don't have any power, but I'm hearing the opposite, that have quite a bit more than probably the average person would assume that we have as a whole.
Absolutely true. And I will say it changes when you've got competent representation. And so there are studies out there that say where you've got community issues, the community does a lot better when it engages in the services of NGOs that understand the issues and know how to take the case forward.
Non-governmental organizations.
NGOs or non-governmental organizations, exactly. And there are lots of
that'd be like UNICEF or examples.
Could be or environmental organizations, and there are all kinds. UNICEF is more a world sort of, United Nations is a little less effective there, but there are plenty of organizations that are used to dealing with protection of, tribal lands, of the sea, of, various environmental issues and all the rest of it. And I think communities who know what they're doing in terms of, and want to have an impact, I think are well placed to sort of also prepare themselves. We're sort of getting into another subject, which is negotiations. But my friend I spoke of earlier used to say that there are 3 important words in negotiation, and they are prepare. And then the second word, of course, is prepare. And the third word is prepare. So if you know what you're doing, you'll be more effective. And to be fair, from a mediator's perspective, if the parties are prepared, I can do a lot better. I can do a lot more for them if we have to discover things through the process. It's not as easy.
Right. Did you ever mediate between NGOs? Was that ever?
No, I haven't. No, that'd be interesting. Yeah. Well, NGOs are just like big companies. They're very complex. They have multiple levels of, reporting authority. Not easy.
Yeah.
Not easy.
Well, Mark, I appreciate it and enjoyed the conversation again. And, thanks again for your time and all the input and knowledge. So
No worries. No
really
worries at
appreciate
all.
it. All right. Well, yeah, again, appreciate it. And I'll talk to you later.
Okay. Take
All right.
care. Ciao.
Bye bye.